There is a letter lost in the archives of the Kingdom of Spain that would forever change the conversation about cancer, and it was written by the same man who destroyed the world that made it possible. Hernán Cortés was not one for easy praise. He was a man of calculation, of self-interest, of strategic silences. His letters to King Charles I, who was also the fifth in the Holy Roman Empire, are full of politics, ambition, and justifications. Not of wonder. And yet, sometime in the first half of the 16th century, Cortés placed a fruit he had never seen before crossing the Atlantic in a wooden box, and wrote to the most powerful monarch in Europe something no victorious general usually says to his king: that there were things in this world that the doctors of the old continent could not cure, and that this green fruit with crocodile-like skin was one of the answers. We don't know exactly what arrived at the court in good condition. Tropical fruits didn't survive well for 4 or 6 weeks on a ship. But we do know that the fruit in question was already known in Caribbean markets, in the orchards of the Mesoamerican coasts, and in the medicinal gardens of the kingdoms Cortés had conquered. And we know that the peoples who cultivated this fruit, Taíno, coastal Maya, Totonac, Mosquito, and communities from the lowlands, used it not only as food but also as medicine. For persistent fevers, for parasites that ravaged from within, for inflammations that had no name, and for something the chroniclers recorded cautiously, as if the word made them dizzy, for tumors. 460 years after that letter, a team of researchers from Purdue University in Indiana published in 1997 the results of an analysis of the active compounds in that same fruit. They called them Annonaceae acetogenins. And the results they found when they tested these molecules against tumor cells in the laboratory were so extraordinary that the article took time to be accepted by the scientific community, not because the data was flawed, but because they seemed too good to be true. 10,000 times more potent than adriamycin, one of the most widely used chemotherapy drugs in the world, at killing cancer cells. And with a difference that, in oncology, is often overlooked, apparently much less toxic to healthy cells than to cancerous ones. The fruit is called Soursop, and its story is, at the same time, one of the most fascinating in American medical botany and one of the most painful of knowledge suppressed by omission, not by a movie conspiracy, but by the quiet and implacable mechanisms of the pharmaceutical market, the criteria for scientific funding, and a system that doesn't quite know what to do with a tree that cannot be patented. Before we talk about laboratories and acetogenins, we need to go back to where it all began. Because soursop didn't come into the world as an object of study, it arrived as a backyard tree, providing shade and food, a remedy used by mothers and healers, a market fruit, and a source of illness. And to understand what modern science is beginning to confirm, we must first understand what millions of people on 3 continents already knew, and had known for more than 2,000 years. The tree's botanical name is Annona muricata, and botanists believe it originated in the Caribbean and the tropical lowlands of Central and Northern South America. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, soursop was already a cultivated tree, not a wild one. This means that some people, probably several at different times, had decided it was worth domesticating, planting it near their homes, and ensuring there would be more of it. Domestication is not an accident. It is a statement of value. The Taíno people of the Greater Antilles, the original inhabitants of what are now Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica, had a name for the tree that Spanish chroniclers recorded with different spellings: guanabana, guanabana, soursop in the English versions, corosol in the French. The Taíno word was almost completely lost with the extermination of that people in the first 50 years of colonization. But the tree survived because it was useful, because it provided shade in patios, because its fruit was enormous, sometimes 4 or 5 kilograms, and both sweet and sour, and because everything about it, the leaves, the bark, the roots, the seeds, the fruit itself, had some use that Caribbean folk healers had identified through generations of observation. They were empirical observers. They didn't have microscopes, chromatographs, or the language of organic chemistry. But they had something modern science tends to underestimate: time. Generations of time. A grandmother who saw what worked and what didn't, who told her daughter, who told her daughter, who saw it in different situations, in different bodies, in different seasons. That kind of longitudinal observation, repeated over thousands of cases for centuries, isn't witchcraft. It's epidemiology without statistics, pharmacology without nomenclature, toxicology without a laboratory. It's pre-scientific science, incomplete, yes, but not invented. When the first Spanish chroniclers began to gather information on the medicinal uses of New World plants, soursop appeared in several documents with remarkable consistency. Father José de Acosta, in his 1590 Natural and Moral History of the Indies, already described tropical fruits with medicinal properties and placed them within the context of the indigenous knowledge that the colonizers were beginning to study, sometimes with genuine curiosity and sometimes with the practical intention of finding useful resources for the crown. Francisco Hernández de Toledo, the personal physician of King Philip II, who led the first formal scientific expedition to the New World between 1571 and 1577, documented medicinal plants of New Spain with astonishing rigor for his time. His work, 16 handwritten volumes, is a goldmine that historians of medicine continue to explore. In these texts, alongside hundreds of other plants, the Annonaceae family appears, with their uses documented by local populations. But perhaps the richest and best documented tradition of the medicinal use of soursop is found in the Afro-Caribbean and indigenous communities. In Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean coast of Colombia and Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Lesser Antilles, the tree is called guanabana or guanabano, and its medicinal use is so commonplace that it forms part of culinary knowledge, not traditional healer knowledge. An infusion of the leaves, 5 or 6 fresh leaves boiled in a liter of water for 10 minutes, is given for fever, nervousness, insomnia, and mild hypertension. Crushed leaves are applied to the skin for inflammation. The roots are used less frequently, with more caution, for more serious ailments. And then there's the use that no colonial chronicler knew exactly how to record because they lacked the concept to name it. It's anti-tumor use. Not in the sense of cancer, that word, that paradigm, was foreign to the medical thinking of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, but in the sense of internal growths that shouldn't be there. Lumps. Swellings that wouldn't subside. Something growing where it shouldn't. For that, traditional use pointed to the leaves, the bark, the roots. Not the pulp. The pulp was food, pleasure, refreshment in the tropical heat. The most potent medicinal parts were the others. There is one detail that modern researchers find significant when reviewing the ethnobotany of soursop in different regions: the geographical consistency of its use. In Jamaica, the leaves are used for cancer. On the Caribbean coast of Colombia, the leaves are used for cancer. In Brazil, where the tree is called graviola, the leaves are used for cancer. In Mexico, in the hot lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco and the coast of Guerrero, the leaves are used for cancer. In Nigeria and Ghana, where the tree arrived with the slave trade and became so naturalized that many Africans no longer know it is native to the Americas, the leaves are also used for cancer. When the same medicinal use appears independently in cultures that did not communicate with each other, that is not collective superstition. That is empirical convergence. That is a sign that something in those leaves works. The soursop arrived in Spain around the same time as other plant wonders from the New World. Along with the tomato, cacao, avocado, and chili pepper, along with vanilla and papaya, along with the pineapple, which Europeans called Annona, following the Guarani name. But there was a fundamental difference between the soursop and all those other fruits. The soursop did not survive the journey well. It was too fragile, too perishable. It reached its peak in just a few days and rotted quickly. It wasn't like cacao, which could travel dried. It wasn't like vanilla, which could travel cured. It was a fruit that thrived only in the tropics where it grew, and that made it a rarity in botanical gardens and for kings with greenhouses. Philip II ordered it cultivated at the royal site of El Escorial, along with other tropical plants that his botanists brought from the New World. But not a commodity, not an ingredient in the European pharmacopoeia, not a plant that 16th and 17th century physicians could study regularly. Knowledge of it remained on the American side of the ocean, in the orchards of colonial estates, in the backyards of tropical houses, in the popular markets of Cartagena de Indias, Veracruz, and Havana, in the oral tradition of the healers whom the colonizers called witches when they were indigenous or black, and herbalists when they were mestizo and already sufficiently assimilated. In Mexico, the soursop tree has its own unique geographical habitat. It doesn't grow on the cold plateaus of the highlands, nor does it thrive at high altitudes in Oaxaca or in the high plains of Michoacán. It needs warmth, humidity, and fertile soil. It grows on the Pacific and Gulf coasts, in the lowlands of Chiapas and Tabasco, in the warmer parts of Veracruz, and along the coastal strip of Guerrero and Colima. In these regions, the tree is so ancient in the landscape that farmers no longer remember if it was planted or if it was always there. It grows in the orchards behind the house, alongside mango, lemon, and guava trees. It provides shade in the summer, fruit in season, and leaves year-round. Doña Celia, a healer from the mountains of Veracruz, who learned the trade from her mother and grandmother in a village where the nearest doctor is a 4-hour walk away, prepares the soursop leaf infusion with a precise method perfected by her lineage over generations. Not just any leaves, the dark, mature leaves from the interior of the tree, not the young tips or the overly old, yellowed leaves. She boils them gently, not vigorously, because she says that a strong boil takes away the good stuff. She lets it cool covered. She gives it on an empty stomach, and she reserves it for the cases she considers most serious, those that doctors haven't been able to resolve, tumors that grow when they shouldn't, pains that have no clear diagnosis. She doesn't say it cures, she says it helps, that some people get better, that others don't. That it must be combined with whatever the doctor prescribes. There is more epistemological honesty in that statement than she is given credit for. In the bustling markets of the hot lowlands, the Tlapacoyan market, the Papantla market, the open-air markets along the Guerrero coast, soursop is sold fresh when it's in season, between November and March. But the dried leaves, wrapped in newspaper, are also sold for a ridiculously low price. And the seller knows exactly what they're bought for. Not for making refreshing drinks, for the infusion, for serious illness, for when other options have been exhausted, or when the healthcare system's options are financially inaccessible, which is not uncommon in these regions and which is itself another scandal that will have to be addressed another time. In northern South America, the story of soursop takes on another dimension. In Colombia, Venezuela, and the lowlands of Ecuador and Peru, the tree has deep historical roots, linked to both the indigenous peoples of the coast and the Afro-descendant communities that arrived during the slave trade, bringing with them their own medicinal knowledge from West Africa. This knowledge sometimes overlapped with American traditions in ways that ethnobotany is still trying to decipher. In Cartagena de Indias, Barranquilla, and the Chocó region, soursop, sometimes also called catuche or Annona, depending on the area, is as natural a part of traditional medicine as it is of food. Cold juice is a refreshing drink. Hot infusion is a remedy. The University of Antioquia in Medellín has published several studies over the past 20 years on Colombian medicinal plants with potential anti-cancer activity, and soursop appears regularly in this body of work, not as a cure, but as an object of study. As a plant that communities use with conviction and that science has an obligation to examine without condescension or preconceived notions. This approach, neither blind faith nor automatic disdain, but methodical research, is precisely what has begun to yield results. Let's return to the Caribbean for a moment, because there's a chapter of this story that's often mistold. When enslaved Africans arrived in the Caribbean during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, they encountered a flora unfamiliar to them. But they brought their own botanical knowledge of African plants that sometimes had properties analogous to those found in the Americas. The adaptation process was astonishing. In just a few generations, Afro-Caribbean communities had incorporated soursop into their medicinal system, fusing it with Yoruba, Akan, and Bantu knowledge. The result was a syncretic herbalism, Caribbean in the truest sense, a product of three worlds, that held soursop at its center. For practitioners of obeah medicine in Jamaica, Soursop wasn't simply a medicinal plant. It was a plant with power, with history, with respect. In Brazil, the equivalent is called graviola, and the word comes from Portuguese, which in turn borrowed it from an indigenous language of the Brazilian coast. Brazilian graviola is the same botanical species as Caribbean soursop and Mexican soursop. Same tree, same active compound, same medicinal use. In northeastern Brazil, in the states of Bahia, Pernambuco, and Maranhão, graviola is as central to traditional medicine as it is in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And it was precisely in Brazil where research on its active compounds received one of its first Latin American impetuses, before the Purdue publication catapulted the topic to international scientific attention. The spread of the soursop tree throughout the American tropics and subtropics during the colonial period was partly deliberate and partly spontaneous. The Franciscans and Dominicans who established convents in the lowlands cultivated it in their gardens alongside other plants used for medicinal and culinary purposes. The religious orders of New Spain, the same ones that produced medicines in their convent pharmacies and documented plants in their herbaria in the highlands, worked with a different, tropical, and exuberant raw material in the warmer regions. The Jesuits, until their expulsion in 1767, had established a system of botanical knowledge applied in their missions in southern Mexico, Central America, and South America that included plants like the soursop, with a scientific rigor that the 19th century took decades to regain. It wasn't just indigenous knowledge that preserved the use of soursop. It was also religious, monastic knowledge that historians of Latin American medicine have begun to rescue from oblivion. The archives of some Franciscan convents in Veracruz and on the coast of Michoacán contain references to tropical medicinal plants, including those of the Annonaceae family, in handwritten recipe books from the 17th and 18th centuries. These documents are treasures of American medical history and are, for the most part, unstudied, gathering dust in archives that lack the resources to classify them. Meanwhile, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Western scientific world was preoccupied with other matters: bacteriology, born from the work of Pasteur and Koch; chemical synthesis, which was producing the first modern medicines: aspirin, penicillin, insulin. It was the century of the laboratory and the synthetic compound, and in this context, traditional medicinal plants were relegated to the status of pre-modern, to folkloric curiosities with no real value. A hospital doctor in 1930 didn't prescribe soursop leaf infusions. He prescribed sulfonamides. And if someone mentioned soursop, he listened condescendingly and changed the subject. This systematic contempt, institutionalized, not necessarily malicious, but rather the product of a paradigm that equated progress with chemical synthesis, was the silent mechanism by which knowledge about soursop was relegated to the margins. It wasn't a backroom pharmaceutical conspiracy. It was something simpler and more pernicious: the assumption that the new was better than the old, that the synthetic was superior to the natural, that the knowledge of a healer from the mountains of Veracruz was inferior to the knowledge of a doctor from a European university. This assumption wasn't malicious in every case, but its consequences were devastating. Because while science looked the other way, the tree kept growing. The leaves kept falling to the damp soil in Doña Celia's backyard. The grandmothers kept brewing the infusion. The markets kept selling the dried leaves. And in the bodies of people who didn't have access to modern medicine, because of poverty, geography, mistrust, or a combination of all those reasons, something kept happening. Not always, not predictably, not in a way that anyone could control or document, but something. And we arrive at the crux of this story, the place where indignation and hope intertwine until they become a single point. In the second half of the 20th century, the pharmaceutical industry began to turn its attention to tropical plants, with an interest that was anything but romantic. It was about patents, about isolable active compounds, about molecules that could be synthesized in the laboratory and sold at the price of modern medicines. The anti-cancer drug vincristine, derived from the rose periwinkle, an ornamental flower from Madagascar, had demonstrated in the 1950s and 60s that plants could produce molecules with significant anti-tumor activity. Taxol, derived from the Pacific yew, had done the same in the 1970s and 80s. The message was clear. Nature had found solutions that synthetic chemists took decades to imagine. They had to be sought out. They had to be found. They had to be isolated, the synthesis patented, and then sold. It was in this context that the tropical tree known in the laboratory as Annona muricata began to arouse serious scientific interest. Not in Mexico, not in Colombia, not in any Spanish-speaking country with a millennia-old tradition of its use, but in the laboratories of the National Cancer Institute in the United States, in universities throughout the English-speaking world, in the chemistry departments of major institutions in the global north that had begun cataloging tropical biodiversity with an eye toward intellectual property. The U.S. National Cancer Institute began studying Annona muricata in the 1970s. Not because someone at the institute had read the recipe books from the Franciscan convents of Veracruz, but because, during expeditions to collect tropical plants with pharmacological potential, soursop appeared in the samples with signs of activity worth investigating. In 1976, the institute recorded cytotoxic activity capable of killing cells, in soursop extracts. It didn't publish much. It didn't make much progress. The active compound was still not precisely identified. And in the absence of a clearly defined, patentable compound, institutional interest waned. The real turning point came in 1997 with the publication by Jerry McLaughlin's team at Purdue University. They had been working for years on the chemistry of Annonaceae, the botanical family to which soursop belongs, which also includes cherimoya, custard apple, ilama, white sapote, and dozens of other tropical American fruits. And they had precisely identified the class of molecules responsible for the most remarkable biological activity: acetogenins. The acetogenins of the Annonaceae family are not a single compound. They are a large family. The Purdue team identified and isolated more than 40 different compounds belonging to this family in soursop, with a characteristic molecular structure and a mechanism of action that, in laboratory studies with tumor cells, proved to be impressively specific. Why specificity? Herein lies the scientific heart of this story, and it deserves to be explained without oversimplification, but without unnecessary technical jargon. Cancer cells have extraordinary energy demands. To grow and divide uncontrollably, which is exactly what they do, they need to produce energy at rates far exceeding those of a normal cell. This energy production occurs primarily in the mitochondria, the cell's internal structures that function as generators. The acetogenins in soursop act as inhibitors of complex 1 of the mitochondrial respiratory chain, the first link in the process that produces cellular energy. By blocking this mechanism, they deprive the cell of fuel. The cell dies. So far, the mechanism sounds simple. The obvious question is, if it blocks energy production, doesn't it also kill healthy cells? And this is where Purdue's results astonished the scientific community. Soursop acetogenins showed a marked preference for cancer cells over healthy cells in the trials. Not perfect. No anti-cancer compound has perfect selectivity, but significant. And McLaughlin's team compared this activity to doxorubicin, which, at the time, was one of the most widely used chemotherapy drugs. And the results showed that some soursop acetogenins were up to 10,000 times more potent than doxorubicin in cell cultures of certain tumor lines, with less toxicity to healthy cells. 10,000 times. That number circulated throughout the academic world. And then, it circulated throughout the non-academic world. And along the way, it was distorted, amplified, transformed into a promise no one had made, a cure no one had proven, a miracle the pharmaceutical industry was hiding. And this is where we need to be very precise, because the real story is fascinating without embellishment, and embellishment has done it enormous harm. What Purdue demonstrated in 1997 was in vitro activity. In vitro means in cell culture, in a petri dish, under laboratory conditions that do not replicate the complexity of the human body. The potency a molecule shows in cell culture does not automatically predict its effectiveness in a living organism. Many compounds that work spectacularly in vitro fail in vivo because the body degrades them before they reach the tumor, because they are not orally bioavailable, because they have toxicities that do not appear in cell culture, or because the tumor in the body is protected by mechanisms that do not exist in the petri dish. Purdue's research was an extraordinarily promising starting point. It was not the end of the road. And at no point did its authors claim it was a cure for cancer. But that's not what was read outside the laboratory. What was read was the simplified headline, 10,000 times more powerful than chemotherapy. What was published in email chains that circulated for years throughout Latin America was the distorted version. Soursop cures cancer, and the pharmaceutical industry is hiding it. What cancer patients with poor prognoses were told was, "Don't have chemotherapy, drink soursop juice." And therein lies the real crime of this story. Not that of the pharmaceutical industry, which in this case acted ambiguously but not necessarily criminally. Not that of the Purdue researchers who published their results with all due scientific caution. The real crime was that of the information ecosystem that transformed a legitimate scientific promise into a false certainty, leading seriously ill people to reject treatments that could have saved their lives. That happened. It's documented. There are oncologists in Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and Spain who treat patients every year who arrived too late, much too late, because for months they drank soursop juice instead of undergoing the surgery or chemotherapy their doctor had recommended. That's not soursop's fault. It's the fault of an information ecosystem that can't distinguish between "this shows promising signs" and "this works." And this yet is very important, the scientific promise was real. The research that followed Purdue's findings did not disprove the results of 1997. It confirmed them, expanded upon them, and refined them. Since then, more than 400 scientific studies on soursop and its active compounds have been published. And the picture that emerges from this literature is that of a plant with an extraordinarily rich biochemistry, with multiple mechanisms of action on tumor cells, with demonstrated in vitro activity in pancreatic, lung, breast, colon, prostate, and liver cancer cell lines, virtually in all cell lines that have been evaluated, with anti-inflammatory, anti-parasitic, and antimicrobial effects, and with a history of traditional use that science is now beginning to methodically validate. But without a single randomized clinical trial in humans demonstrating efficacy in cancer. None. As of the date these words were written, none. And that absence, which is the central void in this whole story, is not accidental. It is the direct consequence of a medical research system that requires enormous funding for human clinical trials, and whose main source of funding is pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies invest in clinical trials when they can patent the compound they are studying. Soursop is a tree. Its active compounds are not patentable in their natural form. No patent, no commercial exclusivity, no investment. No investment, no clinical trials. No clinical trials, no approval. No approval, no prescription. Without a prescription, the healer remains a witch. This is the real mechanism, not conspiratorial, not malicious in an individual sense, but systemic and, in its consequences, devastating. There are molecules with decades of in vitro evidence that will never reach a clinical trial because no company can justify investing the hundreds of millions of dollars it costs to demonstrate efficacy in humans if it won't recoup that investment through the exclusivity of a patent. And this system, which is the system that funds almost all the medications we use today, structurally and permanently excludes any naturally occurring compound that cannot be modified and patented. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Sierra de Veracruz, the dark leaves of the soursop tree continue to fall to the damp soil of Doña Celia's backyard, and the 2,000-year-old knowledge continues to circulate, silently, from mouth to mouth, from hand to hand, without clinical trials, without approval, without anyone with the power to change it deciding that it's worth trying. The acetogenins in soursop don't act on tumor cells in just one way. That's what makes the recent research both more complex and more interesting than the simple headline from 1997. Studies published in the last decade have begun to unravel the mechanisms with a precision that the first generation of researchers could not achieve. The blockade of the mitochondrial complex 1, the initial mechanism identified by the Purdue team, remains the most studied and best documented. But it is not the only one. Researchers from the Autonomous University of Nuevo León published an analysis in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology in 2015 of the effects of soursop leaf extracts on pancreatic cancer cell lines. one of the cancers with the worst prognosis and least response to conventional treatments, and found that the mechanism of action was not limited to energy blockade. The extracts studied also induced apoptosis, programmed cell death that tumor cells learn to evade, and reduced the migratory capacity of cancer cells, the mechanism that allows metastasis, the colonization of distant organs. This dual or triple mechanism is significant. A drug that only kills tumor cells at the primary site may be ineffective if it doesn't stop their spread. The data from Nuevo León suggested that the compounds in Soursop acted on several fronts simultaneously. However, the study was in vitro. Pancreatic cell lines studied in the laboratory do not replicate the complexity of a tumor in a living human body, with its blood supply, its immune microenvironment, and its drug resistance mechanisms. A team from the University of Salamanca, one of the oldest universities in the world, with a tradition in pharmacognosy dating back to the 16th century, published a systematic review of the scientific literature on Annonaceae and their acetogenins in the context of cancer in 2018. Their conclusion was cautious but unequivocal. The preclinical evidence, laboratory and animal model evidence, was robust and consistent. Acetogenins from Annona muricata showed reproducible anti-tumor activity in multiple independent laboratories, in multiple countries, and in multiple cell lines. This cross-laboratory consistency is important. When a result appears in only one laboratory, it may be an artifact, an error, a peculiarity of local conditions. When the same result appears in Nuevo León, in Salamanca, at Purdue University, at the University of Antioquia, at the National University of Singapore, and in institutes in South Korea and Thailand, the probability that it is an artifact decreases dramatically. Something real is happening in those cells when they encounter the acetogenins of Soursop. The Phytochemistry Research Group at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, has been one of the most active in the study of Mexican Annonaceae. The Institute of Chemistry at UNAM, in Mexico City, has decades of experience characterizing bioactive compounds from Mexican tropical plants, and Annona muricata has been a focus of their research since the 1990s. Their findings complement international data with a specific botanical dimension. The chemical composition of soursop extracts varies depending on the growing region, altitude, soil type, and the part of the plant used. Leaves cultivated on the coast of Veracruz do not have exactly the same proportion of acetogenins as leaves cultivated on the coast of Guerrero. The roots have distinct profiles compared to the leaves. The seeds concentrate some compounds in much higher proportions than any other part of the tree. This variability is pharmacologically important and, at the same time, one of the greatest challenges for clinical research. A conventional drug has a precisely defined chemical composition. Each adriamycin tablet contains exactly the same amount of the same compound. A soursop leaf infusion made with leaves from Veracruz in January is not the same as an infusion made with leaves from Guerrero in July. This heterogeneity, which is characteristic of all plant products, makes clinical trials more complicated to design and interpret. But it doesn't make them impossible. The example of Taxol is illustrative. Taxol, whose generic name is paclitaxel, is a naturally occurring compound isolated from the bark of the Pacific yew tree. When it was first described in the 1970s, the heterogeneity of the plant material was one of the obstacles. The solution involved isolating the active compound, precisely characterizing it chemically, and subsequently developing a partial synthesis that allowed for its homogeneous production. Today, paclitaxel is one of the most widely used cancer drugs in the world. The journey from tree to clinic took 20 years and required massive public investment, primarily from the U.S. National Cancer Institute, because no private company could patent the original molecule, given its natural origin. The parallel with soursop acetogenins is striking, and what's lacking isn't preclinical evidence. That exists, it's abundant, it's consistent. What's lacking is precisely the public investment that, in the case of Taxol, came from the United States government. Because in the last 20 years, public budgets for biomedical research, both in Spanish-speaking countries and in the rest of the world, have been under constant pressure, and funding for natural product research has decreased relative to that dedicated to biotechnology, genomics, and immunotherapy. There is another aspect of modern soursop research that deserves attention and that simplified headlines never mention. Soursop acetogenins are also toxic. They are not harmless. The mitochondrial complex 1 they inhibit is not only found in tumor cells, it exists in all cells of the body, including neurons. And there is research linking chronic exposure to some annonaceous acetogenins with a type of atypical Parkinsonism, a neurodegenerative disease that resembles Parkinson's but does not respond in the same way to standard treatment. This link was first identified on the island of Guadeloupe in the French Caribbean, where neurologist André Lanizel and his colleagues observed an unusually high incidence of an atypical Parkinsonian syndrome in the local population during the 1990s. The ensuing epidemiological research pointed to the chronic consumption of fruits and plants from the Annonaceae family, soursop, cherimoya, and particularly West Indian soursop, as a risk factor. Subsequent studies, published in journals such as Movement Disorders and Neurology, found that soursop acetogenins were neurotoxic in animal models at relatively high doses and after prolonged exposure. This finding is important and is often silenced by those who promote soursop as a miracle cure. Not because it invalidates its potential anti-cancer properties, toxicity is dose-dependent, and animal models don't always accurately predict human effects, but because it forces a conversation about dosage, duration, and method of administration that irresponsible dissemination systematically avoids. An occasional infusion of soursop leaves is not the same as consuming liters of soursop juice every day for months. The difference in dosage can be the difference between an interesting biological effect and progressive neurological damage. Honest science doesn't choose between potential and risk. It examines both simultaneously. And what current scientific literature says about soursop, when read without bias, is this. There are compounds in this plant with reproducible and extraordinarily potent in vitro anti-cancer activity. The mechanisms are well characterized. The preclinical evidence is promising. And the potential neurological toxicity associated with chronic consumption is a real risk that requires further research and makes careful design of any therapeutic use mandatory. What has been missing for 25 years since the Purdue publication, is the step that transforms that preclinical evidence into clinical knowledge. The well-designed, independently funded human trial, free from commercial interests, that finally answers the question that 2,000 years of traditional use have posed without a formal scientific answer. If you feel right now that someone should have answered that question decades ago and didn't, you're not wrong. Subscribe to this channel, because every week we open a case like this, and the next one is just as urgent. The story of that unanswered question, however, has an unexpectedly hopeful chapter. And it unfolds, like many of the best stories in this series, not in a laboratory in the global north, but in places where the plant has been grown for generations. In Oaxaca, in the Sierra de Juarez Mountains, there are Zapotec communities that have cultivated soursop in their backyards for generations. Not as a commercial crop, soursop doesn't withstand the cold of the mountains well at altitudes above 800 meters, so it's grown in the transition zones between the mountains and the coast, in the warm, humid valleys. But as a family tree, as botanical heritage, as part of that system of knowledge the Zapotecs call the healer's milpa, the collection of medicinal plants that a family keeps near their home and that constitute their primary healthcare system. That system hasn't disappeared. It's under pressure. Migration, urbanization, rural depopulation, and the replacement of family gardens with commercial export crops have eroded that knowledge at an alarming rate, but it hasn't vanished. In Veracruz, the state's Ministry of Agriculture has promoted programs in recent years to rescue local varieties of tropical fruits, including soursop among its priorities. These programs are not motivated by cancer research. That's not the language of agricultural programs, but rather by the more pragmatic argument of nutritional value, the market for differentiated products, and the agritourism potential of a fruit that urban consumers are increasingly aware of and seeking out. The indirect result of these programs is that soursop trees in rural Veracruz communities have gone from being an invisible part of the landscape to an economic asset in their own right. This change in status, however mundane it may seem, has consequences for the preservation of knowledge. When the plant is valued, people talk about it. When people talk, knowledge circulates. When knowledge circulates, it is not lost. In Spain, interest in soursop stems from a different source. The Royal Botanical Garden of Madrid maintains collections of tropical American plants, some of which trace their origins back to materials brought back by 18th-century botanical expeditions. Those of José Celestino Mutis in the Viceroyalty of New Granada, Cese and Moceño in New Spain, and Hipólito Ruiz and José Pavón in the Viceroyalty of Peru. These expeditions, financed by Charles III and Charles IV, produced monumental herbaria. Mutis's herbarium alone contains more than 20,000 specimens, which are now primary sources for phytochemical research. Annona muricata is represented in these collections. And researchers from the Spanish National Research Council, CSIC, working at the Royal Botanical Garden, have access to historical materials that complement modern studies in chemistry and pharmacology. In herbal shops in Barcelona, Seville, Granada, and Madrid, dried soursop leaves have been sold for at least a decade as part of the growing selection of medicinal plants imported from Latin America. The average Spanish consumer who walks into a neighborhood herbal shop and asks for soursop has usually arrived there because someone in their family has cancer and they've read something about it online. The person working at the herbal shop, in the best-case scenario, a university-trained herbalist, in the worst, someone with varying levels of knowledge, faces the same dilemma as any complementary health practitioner. How to explain the true potential without creating false hope. How to mention the real risks without discrediting a tradition with 2 millennia of empirical history. That delicate balance is perhaps the most honest one someone familiar with the literature can offer. Soursop is not a cure for cancer. That statement, uttered by anyone, in any language, is irresponsible until clinical trials prove it. But soursop is not quackery either. That statement is equally irresponsible and ignores decades of serious research at leading institutions. Soursop is a plant with exceptional biochemistry, a 2,000-year history of medicinal use, robust and promising preclinical evidence, toxicity risks that require attention, and an urgent need for commercially independent clinical research. That is what it is. And that, in itself, is remarkable enough. For someone who wants to incorporate soursop into their life in a sensible way, not as a replacement for any medical treatment, but as part of an informed relationship with the medicinal plants in their environment, the wisest path is the one already established by tradition. An infusion of mature leaves. 5 or 6 fresh leaves, or their dried equivalent, in 1 liter of water. Simmer gently for 10 minutes. Let it steep, covered. Drink 1 or 2 cups a day, no more. Always inform your doctor of any pre-existing conditions because drug interactions with some conventional treatments are not well studied, and it costs nothing to be cautious. The seeds should not be used. They concentrate acetogenins in much higher proportions than the leaves, and the risk of neurological toxicity associated with regular consumption is real. People with Parkinson's disease or a family history of neurodegenerative diseases should be especially cautious and consult their doctor before any regular use. Pregnant women should avoid it. There is evidence in animal models of effects on uterine contractions that makes extreme caution advisable during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And people diagnosed with cancer, who, in many cases, are the ones who seek this information most urgently and desperately, deserve the most honest answer possible. Soursop can be part of a lifestyle that supports overall health, but it should not replace any cancer treatment with proven clinical evidence. This distinction is not condescension, it is respect for the lives of people making decisions under very difficult circumstances. The fruit, meanwhile, is simply delicious. The creamy white pulp, with its tropical acidity and deep sweetness, is one of the most complex flavors the Americas have ever produced. In the markets of Mexico's hot lowlands, Tlacotalpan, Nautla, Jaltipan, it's sold in cups with a squeeze of lime and a sprinkle of chili powder, and the contrast between the acidity, the sweetness, the spiciness, and the creaminess is one of those flavors you remember decades later. Soursop water is the go-to drink at birthday parties in homes along the Veracruz coast. Soursop ice cream is what kids choose when no one tells them what to order. The everyday life of the soursop, as food, as pleasure, as part of the sensory landscape of millions of people, is in itself a compelling argument. A tree that has stood for 2 millennia in the backyards of tropical American homes, that has nourished generations, that the conquerors themselves sent as a marvel to their kings, deserves to be studied with the same seriousness and resources given to any synthetic compound that a company has decided is worth investigating. That funding decision, who pays for what research, why, and with what return on investment, is perhaps the most important question the Soursop story raises. More important than any acetogenin, more important than any percentage of cytotoxicity, more important than any comparison to doxorubicin. Because if the system that produces medical knowledge can only fund what it can patent, then we are doomed to systematically ignore what nature has been producing for millions of years of evolution, which is, in terms of chemical variety and biological specificity, infinitely richer than anything any human laboratory has produced in 100 years of synthetic chemistry. The soursop is a tree. It cannot be patented. It grows in Doña Celia's backyard, and in the yard of a house in Guadalupe, and in the botanical gardens of cities that have never seen a tropical plant in their history. And it contains, in its dark, mature leaves, molecules that decades of serious research have shown do extraordinary things with cells that shouldn't exist. That's not all we need to know, but it's too much to keep ignoring. Subscribe to this channel. We open a new chapter of nature's archive every week, and there are records that have been waiting for centuries for someone to read them aloud. The letter Cortés sent to Charles I may never have arrived intact. The fruit that accompanied it certainly arrived rotten, but the tree that produced it is still there, in the same warm, humid soil where the first sailors who crossed the ocean in search of spices found it, discovering a whole world they didn't know existed. It withstood the conquest. It withstood oblivion. It withstood 2 centuries of scientific disdain, and it continues to bear leaves and continues to bear fruit with the quiet patience of one who knows that time is on its side.